few things to do with Telefonica, because we've been involved with 5G NORMA since the beginning, and thank you to the EU for the support to 5G NORMA. But I thought I should just say a few words about Telefonica first and then move into some of the characteristics of 5G. So in terms of Telefonica, we're best known as O2 here in the UK, but we have around 320 million customers in 25 countries. Our investment in R&D is around 1.1 billion euros a year, which is equivalent to 3 million euros a day. So we're trying to innovate in a variety of ways to actually make sure we meet the needs of our customers wherever they are. So we try and move innovation close to our customers in some cases. So because we have close to 100 million customers in Brazil, we do R&D in Brazil as well as in Europe. We also do significant R&D here in the UK, Germany and Spain and Western Europe, and that's why we're pleased to be part of the EU programme at 5G NORMA. We also have lots of incubation activities, and one particular area in London is called WIRA, which continues to support close to 20 startups a year, and we've innovated with around 612 companies to date around the world. Now these tend to be startups, often out of university, but last year our London startups alone raised around £35 million worth of investment funds. So we don't do pure R&D without forgetting the startup approach. We also have an investment vehicle called Telefonica Ventures. We have investment vehicles which concentrate on parts of the world like Latin America, called Amerigo, and indeed other investments that we've made in companies like Sigfox, which help our understanding of technology to meet our customer needs. But overall, it's a big R&D program which covers investments as well as startups and longer-term research. So I'm pleased to be here. I thought I'd cover particularly an introduction to some of the 5G IC activities we've been involved with at the University of Surrey and see how that plays across to some of the 5G interest in this 5G NORMA activity. That means touching a little bit on what is the vision for 5G and for IoT, because actually you can't really divorce the two very easily. And then touch on some questions like, is 5G a panacea for all connectivity requirements or not? And what will 5G offer or not? Clearly that's quite challenging when it's still in the research phase. But clearly many people talk about the target of less than 1 millisecond response time. Many people talk about reaching 10 gigabits per second. Some talk about making sure there's minimum capacity of a gigabit per second and making sure there's high reliability. And that's because the requirements are driving us in that direction. And the requirements are quite important to think about from a market point of view. So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about the markets we see it today in Western Europe, and then move back towards the 5G Innovation Centre activities. So if we take the GSM Association, which I used to be chairman of, we saw 4.7 billion customers, unique customers at the end of last year using mobile, expected to rise to 5.6 billion. Now you might say, I have 2 devices, in which case you might say there are more subscriptions in use, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But then the reality is that the rate of growth is really 3.9% per annum compound average growth rate. We can see that the penetration, or the number of subscriptions per head of population, is still only 63% at the end of last year, rising to 72%. So that shows we've got a long way to go. And when it comes to connecting people to the internet, we need to think about this very seriously, because mobile is the leading driver to connect to the internet. So how do we raise the penetration of connectivity to the internet to 100%? When we look at connections, which reflects therefore the fact that we have more than one handset in many cases, at the end of last year there were 7.3 billion devices in use. Now you might say that's a 99% penetration rate, but as I said already, clearly people have more than one device, therefore not everybody is covered. But that's expected to rise to around 8.9 billion. Again, significant volumes compared to the first generation I was involved with, called analog, through to 2G, 3G and 4G. But the reality is that we can see more and more interest in terms of the connectivity going smarter to access the internet, so to generate more revenues, as we see on the right-hand side. This is driven partly by the growing interest in what are called smartphones and mobile broadband, and therefore when we think about how many smartphones there are in use, we can see 71% is the target for 2020 for mobile broadband connections compared to 47%. So a much higher growth rate in the smartphone penetration growth in the coming years. such that by 2020 we might see something like 5.8 billion of those subscriptions in using smartphones. This data traffic, though, is even more rapid in terms of growth. So the GSMA figures are 49% compound average growth rate. And when you see that rate of traffic growth per annum, 49% compound average growth rate, you start to think, where is the capacity? Where is the capability to handle all that extra data? These are key drivers to drive more investment as well as innovation in next generation networks. This is all pulled together on one busy slide, but you can see more of this both after this event, but also on the GSM Association website, www.gsma.com. And there are some very useful mobile economy slides that look at country indices and continental indices, which are very useful sources of data. So basically what I'm saying is demand is driving this growth in data and therefore investment in new networks. We also see that there are some policy drivers, whether it be European or national, starting to promote innovation, and that's quite interesting. If we think about unicorns, which are worth $1 billion or thereabouts, we can start to see that there are some countries that have more unicorns than others. And I'm pleased to say the UK doing very well, but these big startups that have reached $1 billion in value, you can see by the flags on this particular chart which countries lead. And USA and China certainly are very significant in that area, alongside the UK, Germany, and Sweden, and France. Now, this interest in innovation is very important from a government point of view because they see it drives growth, it drives jobs, it drives GDP. So the reality is we can start to see, as on the right-hand side, that relationship between not just the unicorns, but innovation and growth. And some of the independent resources there, such as Telefonica, Ernst & Young, start to give you more background to that. So clearly innovation is very important to drive this sort of growth and the future needs of our customers. So I have three roles. I'm sorry if the white's not very visible at the back. I'm both the Vice President of Telefonica Europe, having been involved with the launch of GSM in the UK, having chaired the GSM Association, also visiting professor, and also on something called the Enterprise M3 board, which covers Surrey and Hampshire. The last role will become clearer when I talk about 5GIC. This is a picture of the Surrey University City Centre, Guildford Cathedral, and the Surrey University campus. Two of my colleagues from 5GIC will be speaking more about 5G developments on this particular 5G NORMA programme. I hope not to cover what they're going to cover into the level of detail they will touch on. But I think what we're very proud of is that 5 years ago, all the UK operators came together with the University of Surrey and we said, let's look at how do we develop our future together to try and make sure that we get a common approach to research, but particularly a common facility for the UK, which can be used as a test bed, a major test bed for testing what 5G could be for the future requirements. Now, clearly, it's not always easy for competitors to collaborate, but actually we're very pleased with the mixture of collaborations we now have in terms of all the UK operators, some major vendors, and indeed some other specialist companies. We have something like £58 million worth of industrial backing now, £12 million from the UK government Higher Education Funding Agency, and £5 million from Enterprise M3. This took place before I was made a board member of Enterprise M3. But it's a significant facility in terms of investment. Clearly, 5GIC at the University of Surrey works with lots of other parties outside the UK as well, and as such, some of the output from 5GIC will contribute towards the work of standards emerging. So if we look similarly to the chart that Peter showed earlier on, we can see a lot of history in terms of wireless standards evolution. And it's very clear that the research needs to move into standards before it can move into market. So if we look at some of the evolution, when we go back to 1983 or thereabouts, some of the early analog systems launched, and we could see that TACs, or the equivalent analog systems, lasted for a number of years. In the UK, analog TACs shut in 1996. I remember with great chagrin shutting it down because it provided a great service. But actually by then, we already had a very significant GSM footprint. We already had significant international roaming, which analog didn't offer. But more significantly, we had much more capability, choice of handsets, choice of facilities, early access to data, which we didn't really have in the analog world. But by then, we also had planned in 1996 onwards some of our early research on 3G. So this overlapping of the various generations was quite significant. One of the things we see today, though, is that systems tend to coexist in the digital world. So your smartphone today will typically hold not just 4G, 3G and 2G, but also some Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So that coexistence doesn't mean that the end of one arrow means that the end of one generation, because the coexistence plays on in the handset devices. We can also see that we're today in the middle of the research and standardization phase for 5G. So I think it's quite important that we make sure we understand how long 5G will last in terms of its use within the economy. Projected in most countries to be starting in 2020 as a service, but maybe lasting until 2040 or beyond. Another way of looking at it, though, is that we can see the significant differences between the generations from the left-hand side of this chart. We can see that the 2G world was much more about voice. I would also say it was much more about business initially, before we got into the 3G world, which took us much more into the world of data and email, that was beyond simple text messaging. The 4G world, though, we can see being much more dominant in terms of data and broadband, whether it's for the Internet of Things or for the broader individual users. What we can also see with 5G, though, is this layering that's come across in the architecture work of 5G NORMA. How do we split command and control? How do we split communications in this area from the control functions? How do we make sure we think about latency and reliability? How do we make sure the flexibility comes with a limited spectrum available? Now, they're quite challenging issues when you apply the lens of cost to it. But they're also quite challenging when you think about what are the new requirements that we cannot serve today with 4G. Many requirements can be served today with 4G, and indeed its evolutionary steps that are still to be seen. But we can see from a 5G Innovation Centre that there are clear verticals that need some support, whether it be in mobile broadband internet, so a gigabit generation, whether it be in transportation, such as connected cars or connected high-speed trains, maybe in the energy space where we can support smart grid, perhaps in manufacturing for Industry 4.0, and in digital healthcare. Now, we have examples in all of those today where we've either done trials or demonstrators, and some of it can be dealt with on 4G. We need to think very clearly about the needs of those verticals so that we can have some user input for these particular designs of 5G. We also know the internet is going to evolve significantly. We used to, in mobile terms, design things almost as if the internet was integrated. But actually now the internet itself is evolving very rapidly. And the EU work on future internet is highly complementary to this. So we need to think about how will the internet look like going forward with next generation protocols, how can it look in terms of its richness and service, how can the over-the-top services or video services be included. We need to handle much more of that video work. This is taken by one of my colleagues, Stuart Ravel, who works part-time at 5G Innovation Centre. I'm sorry it's very busy, but it actually plots the year 2000 to the year 2030. And it really plots the volume in terms of the left-hand side of subscribers, excluding M2M, for this period 2000 to 2030. It takes the published data for existing customers up to the end of March 2016, and then extrapolates some of the GSM Association forecasts to 2030. The top curve shows the gross number of customers, so out to 2030, excluding M2M, but it also underpins some of the 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G growth. And what you can see is that the peak years, the 2G 2012, that's when it started to peak in terms of its growth and plateau. And then the 3G peak year of 2022, 4G peak year of 2028, and the 5G peak year of 2039. In other words, we've got a long way to go to reach anything like a 5G peak. But it does assume an introduction year in some countries, such as Korea, Northeast Asia, of 2018. What's interesting is to look at the slopes as well, to see whether the slopes are equivalent. The expectation is that there will be a fast slope for 5G, but probably alongside 4G. Also, some of the definitions of these generations might be challenging, because in some parts of the world we might see 2G switched on, so USA. In some parts of Europe we might see 3G switched on. So we need to consider whether the spectrum is reassigned between the generations, the different market patterns. But overall, this is the market that we're talking about. So what is 5G? This is a chart taken initially from the GSM Association, so the source is the GSM Association. For some reason, my light grey is not coming out on the slide here. So if you imagine a light grey bar that goes across 1 millisecond and up to 1 gigabit, there is a part there that is geared towards 5G. For some reason, it's not showing on this presentation. So this plots millisecond delay on the vertical axis, bandwidth throughput on the horizontal axis, and it picks out fixed, nomadic, and on-the-go type services in black, orange, and red. On-the-go I typically call mobile services. The orange ones could be cordless, they could be Bluetooth related. But the more challenging ones for 5G, and will be more in the 5G world, will be on the far right-hand side and on the top line. Now, we can see the higher speeds being reached with 4G, LTE, and LTE Advanced, but we can't really see above 1 gigabit very easily because of spectrum constraints, architectural constraints, and so on. So areas like virtual reality and tactile internet, or really advanced live augmented reality like that. Certainly things like autonomous driving are not a speed issue, they're much more of a latency issue. Whereas a lot of the other items on that area is probably covered with 3G and 4G as we know it today. But that's an interesting way of looking at the ways in which we can set things today. And when my slides are provided to you, I hope the grey chart around the edge shows that. This is the set of requirements from NGMN, which has already been shown by Peter Ross. This gives a very good flavour of some of the ways operators and vendors have come together to look at real requirements in a different way. So areas like high-speed broadband access for everywhere, not just in hotspot coverage. Perhaps better identification of broadband access in dense areas like cities. How do we support high-speed trains? We might not have very high-speed trains in Western Europe, but certainly in some parts of the world, they have very high-speed trains. So how do we support them better? What combination of technologies are needed for that? How do we handle the massive Internet of Things with sensor networks so that there is the large number of sensors that could be connected to a base station as referred to by Misha earlier on? How also do we handle extreme real-time communications? The better example beyond connected car tends to be telesurgery. Would you like to have an operation in an operating theatre with a remote surgeon operating on your body? Perhaps without real minimized delays, you would be very nervous about that. Lifeline communications to support natural disasters, how do we handle that? And how do we then build in other things to do with e-health, which is not really very well connected today, and also even broadcast services. One of the key areas of growth we see today driving data traffic is video. So why do we have the model of telecoms over there and broadcast over there? 5G actually gives an opportunity to actually think about how video delivery might change the way we think about broadcasting. Should the spectrum capacity that's allocated to broadcast and telecoms be the current balance we have today, or should it change in the future because we can deliver more personalized broadcast services with more capacity as well as higher speed? So I think that's a very sound set of requirements for 5G. I think it's reflected back into the NORMA type activity as well in terms of the architectures we need. On a European basis, we've also seen this 5G PPP platform, which is very useful to summarize some of the higher level requirements, whether it be to do with the capacity increase 1,000-fold, or meeting the needs of 7 billion people, or meeting the needs of 7 trillion things. How do we actually reach these capacity increases whilst also saving on energy and saving on latency? And I think those requirements are only as good as the markets you're serving, which is why I'm pleased to see the underlying connection to smart homes and smart cities as shown underneath. Certainly making sure our society becomes much smarter than we see today. This is a more technical overview of some of the 5G IC split in terms of the work. So we can see a lot of work to do with network innovation, a lot of work to do with radio innovation. It's not just cellular, it's not just Wi-Fi. Thinking about combinations of fixed and broadcast, thinking about satellite in the mix, thinking about core networks is all very important. And when we see the core requirements broken down into more engineering terms, we can see quite a long list, whether it's the higher speed, the delay, the bandwidth per unit area, the number of devices. That's the kind of framework. We sometimes also use the term the digital fabric because actually that cross-network piece is as vital as just the single 5G architecture. That cross-network piece is vital to actually bring in some of the areas such as security and policy and identity management. These areas aren't talked about as much as the radio interface or as the core architecture, but actually are a key element to what we need to do. So I think that the three key areas we see having to work are 5G radio, 5G core, and 5G fabric, of which clearly there are many subjects going to be covered in the next 2.5 days. But we can see clearly that there are some significant factors to do with the core as well as the radio, but the fabric perhaps has not had the attention, I would argue, today, particularly when it comes to operator, whether it comes to serving the different verticals, maybe even thinking about the digital marketplace as we see it today. This is a study taken from a mixture of sources, from BIS, the Department of Business, and the Office of National Statistics, the GSMA data. But it actually talks about no longer just the mobile world or a fixed world, but also talks about the verticals and how their demands for 5G could be significant. Just taking each in turn, transport and logistics. Today we have very few connected cars. Certainly we have hardly any driverless cars, very few connected cars. But in a world where all the cars are connected, we need to think about what are the services that would cover the connected car environment. And that could include things like internet on wheels, could include areas such as support to energy management, better support to insurance, better support for breakdown and emergency services, traffic jam avoidance, even city planning or road planning and road building. That's estimated to be a 10.8 billion euro market. That's a significant sum, but I think unless we find ways of working with the automotive and logistics firms, frankly, 5G will miss a major requirement. The second area of business and financial services is more difficult. There are two numbers here. Clearly, we often think about business banking or personal banking, but there are many e-commerce type activities that could be included in this area. We already see early examples of that, such as smartphones being used to pay for your underground tube fare. But starting to imagine e-commerce wherever you are starts to raise questions of security and accuracy and identity management. How do we make sure 5G is ready for that, alongside the evolution that's already taking place with 3G and 4G? Health and social care, 7.7 billion euros for a European market, I think is significant. But today, actually, the connectivity in healthcare is pretty poor. You might see examples of apps or wearables, but actually it's rather thin in terms of that connectivity. We can see a lot more in the way of perhaps self-care and prevention, insurance set schemes, perhaps connected pharmacy research, perhaps solutions that may prevent people staying in hospital too long or releasing them early, because some of the measurement can become much more personal with the Internet of Things and with much greater capability. Again, that raises some big questions of security and identity. Retail and logistics, I've already referred to e-commerce, but actually the whole logistics chain in terms of how do you actually get products to a shop, how do you make sure they're managed in terms of identity, how do you make sure they're ordered. We can see a much bigger online world, but also we can see big improvements to retail and logistics. And lastly, the creative economy and information services. The world of publishing has already changed with the internet. We see that being no different with 5G, but actually 5G is going to continue to evolve much more into video-based services and more personalized information services going forward. So there are 5 pretty big markets that we can see emerging, and we'll see the early beginnings of that in the next 3 years with 4G, but actually a lot more can come with 5G. Again, we need to blend together the radio, the core, and the fabric to make sure that works well. We need a strong underpinning of cyber to make sure cyber security is great, building in security by design and the right identity management. But most of all, I think we need standards that underpin this. So your work and research work leading to standards will be absolutely key. This is how we see it over the next 2 years, just to put it down to near term. Clearly, we can see the technology building blocks having been identified, but I think some of the systems and networks now need to move into that digital fabric arena. We can start to see the ETSI work in 3GPP picking up some of the issues with the ISGs, the industry specification groups. We can see some of the initial standardization work emerging. but I think we need to get ready for this very exciting world, which will touch on so many of those verticals that are shown on that right-hand side. We've got a transport industry specification group launch on the 8th of September down at Surrey, and you'll be most welcome to come to that, where we're specifically looking at how will things like network slicing affect the car industry? How will the Internet of Things touch on the car companies and their delivery? That has to be for new cars as well as existing cars, but we need to work through to make sure we pick up on the impact in that area. So in summary, and to close, if that's all right, that's on time. I think we see 5G as being a key next generation technology, which is much more than core and radio. Clearly, we can see work below 1 gigahertz being vital, particularly for coverage, but we can also see an interest in 1 to 6 gigahertz and indeed millimetre wave. Clearly, the allocation of spectrum may differ country by country, but we need to cover all three areas. We can also see that 5G will evolve and leverage existing assets, whether it's existing networks or existing spectrum. It needs to leverage Wi-Fi in the mix, and that roadmap is in particular. It will, though, blend together much more fully licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So although we see Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in the unlicensed band today, we can see other licensed and unlicensed candidates. Frankly, the existing network nodes need to be used because sites are difficult to come by. We also need to make sure that we build on existing transmission where appropriate. But if we can't find ways of getting fibre to nodes, then there are some basic challenges we need to address in the mix. Lastly, I think 5G will address complex network and system challenges, so we need to be thinking much more about a network of networks and think about the cross-network and cross-boundary challenges. Today, I think 5G is very exciting. I think when we look at the requirements on the right-hand side, we can see some very interesting prospects, whether it be 1 millisecond response times, 10 gigabits per second, or some much higher delivery rates. But unless we work on this together, we won't achieve it. We won't get there by 2020, it might be delayed. So we have to think about managing it to time and also managing it to requirements. The 5G scope is open. Join us now and influence that development. Thank you very much.
If there are any.
One question, is your slide 8, it's about innovation. How do you measure?
I think it was slide 8. How do you measure, so we have this bubble showing the innovation per country. How do you measure innovation?
Well, that particular chart, slide 8, was measuring it against two factors. First of all, the unicorns, and secondly, the impact on the economy of innovation. And their process was looking at the high-tech jobs associated with innovation in relation to key countries. We also, as Telefonica, published a mega index of about 34 countries about 2 weeks ago, called the Telefonica Index on Digital Life. And in that area, we took together a kind of index of indexes to try and look at how different people in society in key countries looked at that. And that's available online as a database, which I'll happily send to you. Internally, we look at innovation as benefiting both our customers and also our business profile. So our business profile requires us to think about cost reduction, service improvement, planning for new markets. So our innovation factors take into account those other internal factors as well. And I'll gladly send you the Telefonica Index on Digital Life. It's a fabulous database of several industries.
And then Alex.
So my question is, I'm not sure if I got it right, but when you were showing about the forecast in the future, one of them was the growth in data rate, which was rather moderate. I think I saw a figure something like 49%. Well, if you look at data growth up to now, it's much more extreme. It's kind of growing exponentially. So I was wondering about this particular piece of data. So what's your expectation in terms of data growth, and how will it compare to data growth we've been experiencing so far?
The data growth on our UK network is growing at a faster rate than that shown by that chart. So that chart came from the GSM Association, their annual report, and it's on their website. I think it's about 46 or 47% compound average growth rate to 2020. The rate of growth we're seeing on our network is much faster than that, and I would suggest in Western Europe it is faster than that. So we have to take into account that's a global figure as opposed to a Western European figure. In addition to that, I think we should take into account that other solutions might be handling the data. So if you think about Wi-Fi handling some of the data, or if you think about other networks handling the data, we might also see that that number changes. So that's a GSMA global cellular figure as opposed to a Wi-Fi figure or a UK figure.
And Alex, last question.
Yes.
And it was data growth, not revenue growth. Traffic growth, not revenue growth.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation about 5G. One element was underplayed here, and I'm not sure if it's a Freudian slip or even more than that. The subject of service in application is computation, fabric. The network of network is fine, it's already here for 30 years, but service networks need to be put in place and application. So without this, the revenue will not increase for operators. And why is that? Any comment on this part of integration of computing and connectivity fabrics?
Well, I think it's a very big question. I think, first of all, services competition exists today as well as networks competition. And we might ask for different views on that. Because how many network operators do you need? How many service operators do you need? And that differs around the world. Not all network operators are vertically integrated to deliver everything, even if they were fully vertically integrated in the 1980s. With regard to services competition, I think computing is helping, there's no doubt about that. But I think what's also helping is getting the economies of scale to actually reduce the unit costs of sensors to get the consistency of standards in place. So I think this is to support growing services competition, not in isolation from services competition. And if I underplayed that, I apologize, but I didn't wish to miss it as your question implies.
All right. So let me thank again the speaker.